biggest problem was clear in front of their faces in 1907 when the financial system failed or there was a panic. And, we've seen plenty of panics in our own time, 1987, 2001, 2, 2008. I don't have to go through them all. And we know what happens. The central bank comes in, pumps liquidity in. After either a longer or shorter amount of time, things go back more or less to normal and off we go. Except in 1907, there was no central bank. So this bank run, it was a good old-fashioned bank run, not something that happened on computer screens. It was people running to the bank because banks had turned very illiquid based on some panics and failures in what started in the trust banks and moved into the standard sort of commercial banks. In any case, there not being a Federal Reserve, the country tried the next best thing, which was His Eminence J.P. Morgan Sr., who called together a bunch of the leading financiers into his famed study. He tried to get them all to put up some money. They put up some. It wasn't really enough. And people began to realize that to have what was now the leading, or sort of about to become the leading industrialized country in the world with a primitive financial system without a central banking system, no longer played. We needed a financial system that was on a par with our industry and our private financial capability. That was to be a lender of last resort was the way they put it, or a reserve bank, literally to create a reserve of capital. So that starts with a guy named Nelson Aldrich. Nelson Aldrich is a classic Gilded Age senator, investor, very close to all sorts of industrialists. He doesn't have the same view, let's say, of conflict of interest or avoiding it that we might wish on him today. He was a mover and shaker amongst industrialists, a power in the Senate, very much a believer in the status quo, which back then did not include a central bank. But after the financial crisis, a little window of doubt began to open up. The Congress authorized a mission to Europe after this panic of 1907 to sort of investigate European systems. Aldrich insisted that he go. He led a team of observers. He talked to people in, of course, England with the Bank of England, France, the Bank of France, ditto Germany. In every country, he asked a version of the question, what do you do when you have panics? And in every country, he got a version of this answer. We don't have them because the central bank intervenes. Aldrich realized that he'd been wrong, that America needed a central bank. He knew the people who could help him form it, beginning with Paul Warburg, the famous immigrant financier from Germany, who had been privately militating for an institution like a European central bank. But Aldrich had a problem, which may sound very familiar to people today. Bankers were not very respected or very trusted among the American public. The American public wouldn't have wanted private bankers to have set up a financial system. So he did something even more conspiratorial sounding. He invited a bunch of them to meet with him in secret to plan this meeting on an island off Georgia where J.P. Morgan Sr. had a private club. And the idea was they're off with nobody paying any attention. They would map out America's financial future or this new institution. They dismissed all of the people who worked at this club, except for a few trusted people who were told not to tell anybody. They pretended to be going duck hunting and actually carried with them rifles and all sorts of paraphernalia. Quite ludicrously, Paul Warburg, for one, wouldn't have known the front end of a barrel from the back end. But when they got down to hard work, they spent 7 or 8 days down there mapping out what this central bank would look like. Someone like the European banks, but different. America was a bigger country. It had a federal system. It didn't have a history of central banks and so on and so on. They had to come up with some American answer. But this was actually, the object later of conspiratorialist dreams, because actually a leading U.S. senator and the top bankers of the country did go down in secret and plan a prototype of what would become the Federal Reserve. Well, I think we're better off. I think the central bank has contained them. I think if you look at the COVID, the pandemic-induced financial crisis of 2020, was a terrific example because not only did the Fed contain it, but it got the country back on its feet and the economy growing again in quite rapid time. Even in 2008, uh, it was contained. It was brutal while it went on, but by I believe June, the end of June 2009, the recession was over and we were growing again. The financial crises of the 19th century were not so benign. The crisis of 1837 lasted 4, 5, 6 years, depending on how you calculate it. When Jay Cooke, the railroad financier, went belly up in 1873, that went on for 6 years. In the 1890s, there was a depression from 1893 to 1896-7. These were hard, brutal, long depressions. So I think it's to the Fed's credit, or it's thanks to the Fed that they don't last so long. I think the Fed is sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. Populists don't like it when the Fed raises rates. After all, the great monetary struggles of the 19th century were all about money being too scarce, i.e., interest rates being too high. That was the cry of farmers, the little people, if you will. Today, we have something else. We have a Fed which has, for a long time and repeatedly insisted on very low rates. You would think this is just what the populists want, but it turns out not to be, because now the cry is, well, low rates are good for investors. They've raised equities. What does it do for us? It's caused inflation, which has overtaken salaries. The poor Fed certainly has had, I think, the best of intentions, but there's always this fear or this conspiratorial urge or suspicion in a period of inequality that the Fed, which is close to Wall Street, is going to be governing and making decisions with Wall Street in mind. I don't envy the job of the Fed in this respect.